Marcus Atilius Regulus, Consul 227 and 217 BCE, Censor 214 BCE. The individual we are about to discuss was, by almost any standard, rather boring. However, a boring man living in interesting times stands out, and we can perhaps learn a good deal by studying his, admittedly, lackluster life in politics. Marcus Atilius Regulus served as consul twice, and also held the censorship. Yet one can argue that he never really stood out or made much of a name for himself, at least in terms of establishing a lasting historical significance. Growing up in the shadow of his father and namesake, who was arguably Rome's greatest hero from the First Punic War, Regulus dreamt of winning undying acclaim for his virtues and his victories. This was the dream of all Roman aristocrats, but Marcus and his younger brother probably felt the pressure more keenly than most. Despite having opportunities and the respect of his peers, Regulus was held back by a combination of having to compete against his own bad luck and the much larger personalities surrounding him in the Senate. The result was an impressively dull career in the middle of the melodrama that was the Second Punic War. Marcus Atilius Regulus hailed from a family which had originally come from Calabria. Although they were neither patrician nor as established as many of their more noble plebeian rivals, the family of Atilius Regulus was very well respected by the late 3rd century. The family first achieved the consulship in the middle to late 4th century, and by the time that Marcus was born, he was on a path to become a 4th generation consul, meaning that he qualified as noble even if he was not quite at the pinnacle of the Roman nobility. His father and namesake, Marcus Atilius Regulus, was consul in 267 and 255. He is sort of the best example I can think of someone who was a major war hero who was not necessarily all that successful. While the elder Regulus did in fact win a major naval battle, he then was responsible for the overland invasion of Africa, which, due to mostly his own mistakes, turned into a complete catastrophe. He then negotiated a deal with the Carthaginians where he took an oath that he would return if the negotiation failed. And despite the pleading of his family to stay in Rome where he would be safe, he upheld his end of the oath, went back to Carthage to report the bad news, and was duly executed. This made him an example of Roman virtue and made him something of a legend. I think that there's quite a bit of evidence that his son and namesake, the subject of this video, very much rode that earned honor and made a career out of it. As for Marcus's younger brother Gaius, he became consul in 225, a year when Rome faced a couple of different threats. He was tasked with putting down a revolt in Sardinia. He did that, and then he joined his colleague against the Gauls in northern Italy, meeting his end at the Battle of Telamon. So 2 generations of Atilius Regulus had gone out and fought and died for Rome with the greatest honor. Marcus, the younger that is, would be expected to do something similar, or to in some way live up to this family name. And while he does seem to have been a fairly competent individual, he never really lived up to the example of either his father or his younger brother. But their fame seems to have really given him a lot of sway within the Senate, as he was established as someone who came from, I guess, what you might call good stock. Given the fame of the name Marcus Atilius Regulus, I think it's a safe assumption that he was elected consul in his first year of eligibility when he would have been 43 years old. Remember, for plebeians, the minimum age is 43 rather than 42. This would mean that he would have been born in 270, and that his colleague might have been born in 269. His colleague that year was Publius Valerius Flaccus, a man who's comparable insofar as he is an obscure member of a very famous family. During this year, Rome was up to quite a bit, and this year is best described in brief as a moment of transition between the mopping up operations in the wake of the First Punic War and Rome's deliberate efforts to conquer Italy up to the Alps, to subjugate all of the Gauls who lived in the north. So this year was a major pivot, and Rome also made some fairly major administrative reforms, yet we don't really know what either Regulus or Flaccus was up to personally. And it doesn't appear that either of them got much of an opportunity to really shine. During the year, the one official who stood out the most was Gaius Flaminius, when he became the first Praetorian governor of Sicily. That does not seem like that big of a deal, but the sources are more interested in his term as the first governor of Sicily than they are in what Regulus and Flaccus were up to. Rome also added Sardinia and Corsica as a new province, both islands but one province. There was a war going on in Illyria, which was wrapping up by this time. In fact, it was probably so close to over by the time they took office that neither consul was dispatched, but that cannot be known for certain. Queen Tuta agreed to Rome's terms because she saw their situation had become completely hopeless. These terms were so restrictive that she was not even allowed to sail ships from her capital even a few miles south of that capital. So she had to stick to the straight and narrow, and it's very clear that Rome set the terms to be so strict so that they could renew war on a whim and finish her off at their leisure. This is basically what happened in 219. One of her successors, who I think was also her assassin, sailed a ship to the south of the demarcation line, got caught doing it, and therefore Rome dispatched both consuls, Paulus and Livius, and finished off Illyria. We don't really know what either Regulus or Flaccus personally contributed, but clearly they did preside over success. However, because this was a year of consolidation rather than conquest, and because both of the new provinces that were added, or the two new governorships, were for praetors, well, they didn't really have much of an opportunity to do anything of note. And most likely it was the last year's officials who finished off the war in Illyria. Also, by the way, you could even argue that Queen Tuta massively outshone Regulus as well. She is still sort of an icon in Albania, and there are a lot of heroic drawings of her leading her men or engaging in piracy or doing whatever, whereas I think it's safe to say that Marcus Atilius Regulus the Younger does not really have much of a following. For a decade after his consulship, we hear nothing about Regulus. Then, at Lake Trasimene, the man who had outshone him back in 227 was killed in spectacular fashion by a Hannibalic ambush. At that point, the Senate decided to appoint Fabius Maximus as dictator for 6 months. During his dictatorship, Fabius tried to avoid battle with Hannibal and reconstitute the army. While he was busy at Geronium shadowing Hannibal and getting the army back into shape, the Senate ordered him to come to Rome in order to choose a second consul to replace Flaminius. While Fabius was in Rome, this is when Minucius changed policy and won a minor victory near Geronium, thus leading to a great deal of infighting among the Romans, both those in the army camp and those in Rome, about whether or not they should stick with the Fabian strategy, and also whether or not Fabius and Minucius should be equal. So all of this drama very much overshadows Fabius's purpose for being in Rome, i.e. to appoint a new consul, a Suffect Consul, meaning basically a replacement consul to finish out a term. Regulus's appointment here, and I believe he was appointed by Fabius rather than actually elected by his peers as a whole, is actually significant, because while Flaminius was a second-time consul and did have a proven military track record, he actually was not elected specifically in response to any military disasters. His election actually occurred prior to the defeats at Ticinus and the Trebia. So technically, Marcus Atilius Regulus holds the honor of being the first Roman consul called off the bench to serve, specifically because he's a proven commander. You could count Fabius Maximus himself as dictator, or even the master of horse Minucius, but in terms of a regular magistrate, it would be Regulus. Yet, no one cares, because again, there was drama afoot, and when people think of 217 after Lake Trasimene, most people just think of Fabius the Delayer, getting his delaying game on and setting the strategy in motion. While it does seem to have been fairly late in Fabius's 6-month term when he appointed Regulus, it isn't clear exactly how much time was left on the clock. And we don't know what Regulus did as the Suffect Consul during the period between his appointment and then his actual assumption of the office, meaning when he actually took up the powers of the consul after Fabius's term expired. His colleague, who was not killed at Lake Trasimene, Geminus, was commanding a fleet and then joined the army in South Italy right before Fabius's term expired. And while we don't know exactly where Regulus was, my guess would be that he went with Fabius and helped him run the army as a tribune. I further think that given the general mood in Rome, which both Polybius and Livy show to be one where most people were unhappy with Fabius's strategy, that part of the reason why Fabius chose Regulus is precisely because Regulus was someone who agreed with him, someone who was a proponent of caution. When Servilius Geminus did rejoin the army and Fabius's dictatorship ended, Atilius took over the men in Fabius's camp, his colleague took over the men in the camp of Minucius, and at this point the two halves of the army officially reunited. Now, there's a nice story in Plutarch and his life of Fabius about how Minucius and Fabius reconciled after Fabius saved him, but it would appear that there was not enough time left for them to reintegrate the armies fully. The two consuls would pull this off after they resumed office. We also don't really know exactly how much time they had left, presumably not more than a month or two, but during the time they did have, they do seem to have been a very effective tandem. Servilius Geminus and Regulus worked together well and did some mischief to Hannibal. According to Livy's speech by Fabius to Paulus, he urges his colleague to go out and keep up the Fabian strategy because he says that Hannibal will run out of supplies eventually if you just keep harassing him, and that using the strategy, Servilius and Atilius had toyed with Hannibal. They had really shown him up. They had exposed his weakness. And I think the point was that this strategy would work under any conditions, at least according to the man who came up with the strategy. Not that he would have a bias or anything. So actually it's interesting that, according to Livy at least, Fabius used the two consuls, Geminus and Regulus, as examples of his strategy working rather than his own conduct. So kind of interesting. I think there's a case to be made, even if it is a very minimal case based on the very minimal evidence, that actually maybe the team of Geminus and Regulus were the true masters of a pure version of the Fabian strategy. In 216, Varro and Paulus were elected consul, and they ran on the explicit policy of raising a massive army and overwhelming Hannibal with the weight of numbers. The idea was to defeat him once and for all and remove the threat that he posed of detaching their allies and breaking apart Rome's hold on Italy. This was something that was immensely popular, and actually Fabius's position was very much in the minority. Supposedly, when he was dictator, Fabius was not really a welcome speaker in front of either the Senate or most gatherings of common people. He was incredibly unpopular, actually, especially toward the end of his dictatorship. So Varro and Paulus are off recruiting men, and they plan to join the army. In the meanwhile, Atilius and his colleague Geminus are prorogued as proconsuls, and they keep command of the field army until the new consuls arrive. Hannibal at this time is still around Geronium, where he wintered, and he decides he needs to march to a more promising area. He hears about a depot at Cannae. Cannae is a place to the south of anywhere that they fought so far, and the Romans have created a supply depot there that they plan to use to feed the horde they're planning to assemble as a way to crush Hannibal. So this is actually an integral part of the Roman plan, this supply depot at Cannae. It's not just a random supply depot. This is campaign specific. Hannibal must have learned about this from his scouts or from some local Italian who came and sold the information, whatever it might be, and so that's exactly where he marched. The Romans had some pickets in place to try to slow him down if he went north or east, but they did not anticipate him just shooting straight south. And that's what he did. And he reached Cannae, took it fairly easily, and now he not only had supplies that he needed very badly, but just as importantly, he was able to deny those to the Romans. This would very much limit the options of Varro and Paulus later, as they had a literal horde assembled and they lacked sufficient supplies to keep it well fed and supplied for the duration of a long campaign. The proconsuls were very aware that this was a major setback, and so they actually requested permission to engage Hannibal before he could really get set up and before the supplies were consumed, but the Senate advised that they wait on the arrival of the consuls and fight their battle there, or wherever Hannibal happened to go next. By early August, Paulus and Varro were on the scene, and they brought with them significant reinforcements, leading to the formation of almost certainly the largest army that Rome ever assembled, whether as a republic or an empire. Varro and Paulus brought their reinforcements to Cannae, and now there was a grand army of some 70 to 90,000 men. The Romans had a huge advantage in numbers when it came to infantry, but they actually were at a disadvantage of both quality and quantity when it came to cavalry. The plan, of course, was to use the weight of their infantry to simply overwhelm Hannibal. Perhaps the Romans did not really trust in their quality after 3 straight defeats at the hands of Hannibal. One of the purposes of the limited campaigning and skirmishing conducted by Regulus and Geminus, at least according to the historian Polybius, was to train the troops, build their confidence and skill. Livy later says that the portion of the army that the proconsuls had was qualitatively superior to the new recruits under the consuls. And as I will actually argue for preferring Livy on something later on, let me here show how Polybius said something that Livy misinterpreted, at least in my opinion. So Polybius was trained as a military man, even though he ended up spending most of his life as a political hostage / historian. But up to the age of about 30, he actually had been training himself to become a general and politician in the Achaean League. So he most likely had some military experience and even a little bit of command experience. And as someone with a strong interest in that, he would have known that the Roman army was an army that was levied, at least during this period. He also still lived in a time when levies were the norm. The Marian reforms only occurred after Polybius' death. Livy, on the other hand, lived in the early imperial period when the Marian reforms meant that there were men who were soldiers and men who were civilians. In the Republican period prior to the Marian reforms, almost every able-bodied male in the civilian population had prior military experience. So anytime you call up a fresh levy, only the very youngest men in that levy would have no experience. A very high percentage of the men would have some prior experience, whether that was simply being called up and trained, marched around, and then sent home, or whether they had fought an extended campaign. So this means that anytime the Romans are calling up troops, they're not calling up completely fresh or inexperienced men. And I think that Livy read this passage in Polybius, where he talks about these troops being trained by Regulus and Geminus being of a much higher quality, and mistook that for the new troops under Varro and Paulus being completely and totally green. So anyway, that is the point for Polybius tonight, and of course later on we will get to why Livy is probably right about something else. And now, before the anticipation kills you, let us get into this massive variance in our two historians. There's a huge variance between Polybius and Livy when it comes to where Atilius was at the Battle of Cannae. According to Polybius' account, Regulus, as proconsul, remained with the Grand Army and shared command of the infantry at Cannae with Geminus, meaning that he was in the center, which was eventually encircled. Livy's account is dramatically different. He says that as soon as the consuls Varro and Paulus arrived, that Regulus approached them and said that he was too ill and too old to continue to serve, that he was tired and needed to go home, and so they dismissed him. He went back to Rome, missed the battle entirely, and later on performed a few more tasks. I believe that Livy is correct when it comes to this issue of where Regulus was. Polybius doesn't mention him again, and does not seem interested in anything that he might have done after the battle, so most likely he wasn't paying close attention to what Regulus did. Normally I would prefer Polybius over Livy because in general he seems to be a better historian in most respects, and also he tends to embellish things less. Also, of course, he was much closer to the time, and he knew some of the sons and grandsons of people who were there. But in this case, I think that Livy has the more valid interpretation. And the reason is because if we look at the tasks that he attributes to Marcus Atilius Regulus after Cannae, the tasks are things that a man who is old and ill could conceivably do without putting himself under too much strain. He also specifically says, when he is mentioning that Marcus Atilius Regulus is one of the men being selected for the task, that he was the two-time prior consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. There could very well be someone else named Marcus Atilius Regulus, given the family is established for several generations. There could be another line with cousins or whatever, but I'm very hard-pressed to believe that there's another guy who's a former two-time consul with the same exact name living at the same exact time. That just defies imagination a little too much, and again, because the tasks that he's assigned are fairly sedentary, and also because both of them take place within a few years of Cannae, this is not incompatible with a man who is ailing. Someone who is toward the end of their life can still do certain things. We don't really know what was wrong with Regulus to begin with. He might have just had a case of gout or something like that, and although Livy says that he was suffering from old age, in reality, he was probably only in his early 50s at this time, so he wasn't that old even by the standards of that period. Anyway, on with the show. We'll first do Polybius's end of Regulus's life, and then do Livy's version of events as well. In Polybius's account of the Battle of Cannae, all of the Romans except for Varro fought very, very bravely, and ultimately died due to the folly of Varro. Regulus was no exception. He commanded the center alongside of Geminus, and the two of them died while trying to resist the encirclement after the Carthaginians pulled off the famous double envelopment against a superior force. According to the Greek historian, quote, both had conducted themselves in the battle as brave men who were worthy to be citizens of Rome. This praise sounds kind of boilerplate and minimal at first blush, but we have to remember something about the historian Polybius. Not only was he interested in history, but he was also a student of Greek political theory. And although he was operating almost 200 years removed from the age of the polis, that is the independent city-state, he and political theory both were still very much stuck in this idea of the primacy of the polis. Plato and Aristotle, who were really sort of the grand figures in Greek political theory even in this time, had very much been a product of that era, and both of them had thought that a man was defined by his place in his polis. Citizenship was also something that the Greeks very much elevated on a higher plane than the Romans. For Greeks, citizenship was very much everything. It meant belonging, participation. It was what defined you and what made you who you are. For the Romans, don't get me wrong, it was important, but it was not as important. So to say that they proved themselves to be worthy of their citizenship by fighting bravely is actually very high praise coming from a Greek historian. So don't mistake this for just being kind of faint praise or boilerplate. This actually is Polybius trying to pay high tribute to the bravery of the two proconsuls. In Livy's account of Regulus's activities after Cannae, which I consider to be more accurate than Polybius's, Rome was in a real crisis after the battle. This should come as no surprise, given that they lost all but about 10,000 of the men who were in their horde. Not only was Rome short on manpower, but also Rome was very short on money. They were worried about their allies not contributing and also defecting, and there was a real sense of panic. This is at the time when the Romans discovered that one of their Vestal virgins had not been living up to her obligations and decided to bury her alive to make things right by the gods. So the Romans are willing and able to take any measure needed to get things back on track. One of the measures that they took was to appoint a triumvirate of financial officials to try to gather and manage Rome's money. Among the three men chosen was the two-time consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. And Livy specifically says that he is a two-time consul, so it can't really be any other Marcus Atilius Regulus. It'd be a very strange mistake to make. There were also two men named to a different commission as Triumvirs, Marcus and Gaius Atilius, and they were tasked with building a temple of Concord that the praetor Lucius Manlius had promised to build at some earlier date, but had not seen through. This Marcus could be our Marcus Atilius Regulus, but it's also possible that he is a younger relative and that he was working with another younger relative in Gaius. Most likely these two are younger relatives of Regulus. One or more of them might be a son, another one might be a nephew or cousin. Remember that Marcus had an adult brother who died at Telamon in 225, so there are a number of options, but because he's already a triumvir of finance, and because we know that his health was a bit shaky, my suspicion is that the Marcus and Gaius Atilius who helped to build the Temple of Concord were in fact either his sons or nephews, or his son and nephew, or something along those lines. In 214, the Romans elected censors once again. The two censors for the year were Marcus Atilius Regulus, representing the plebeians, and Publius Furius Felus, representing the patricians. Under the pressures of wartime, where senators were dropping at a fairly steady rate, it was really important to try to keep up the numbers of the Senate and keep it as close to its nominal strength of 300 as possible. This means that a lot of the dictators who were appointed were tasked with doing this as part of their duties, and that the censors, when they were in office, would be expected to really focus on that aspect of the job. In addition, censors performed a duty known as the lustrum, which is effectively a religious rite where the city is purged, and this was considered something that was important for maintaining a proper relationship with the gods. The Romans very much believed that the gods foresaw and affected the outcomes of battles and wars, so you can imagine that they were very eager to make sure that the lustrum was performed and performed properly. So Regulus and Furius were under a fair amount of pressure to make sure that they did their jobs properly. At some point during their censorship, possibly around the middle, one of the tribunes named Marcus Metellus, who does not seem to have been related to the Caecilii, the noble branch of the Metellii, filed a lawsuit against the two censors because he was angry about how they had treated him during the censorship earlier when he had been a quaestor. They had forced him to abandon his horse and to pay a tax he was supposed to be immune to, so it basically shamed him, and supposedly it was for taking part in some weird conspiracy to abandon Italy that had formed at Cannae. This sounds completely muddled, and I think that Livy must have misunderstood something because this doesn't make any sense. If they really wanted to punish him for taking part in a conspiracy, then they could have used their power as censors to kick him out of the Senate. At that point, he would not have been able to run for the office of tribune of the plebs, most likely, because he would have been humiliated. But they didn't do that, so this whole thing is weird, and I don't really know if the story should be regarded as credible or not. The other 9 tribunes supposedly forced Metellus to let the issue go by effectively threatening him with shunning. And they'd gotten to the end of their term. They had helped to refill some of the ranks of the Senate, but then before they could perform the lustrum, Furius died. And then, as was the custom, a censor could not operate without a colleague, so Regulus was forced to resign early without the lustrum having been completed. So technically speaking, he failed, but this was not his fault, as it boiled down to bad luck. And once again, we see that Regulus was outshone but this time by a colleague who simply kicked the bucket. What is the real legacy and significance of Marcus Atilius Regulus? I ask this as an honest question. Even after having talked about him for half an hour, I'm not entirely sure. I think the main thing that's interesting about him is that the accounts of Polybius and Livy are so variant when it comes to his life, and especially the issue of whether he fought and died at Cannae or not. That seems like a fairly major life event for someone, but we don't even know that for sure about this man. I have to say, in summary, Marcus Atilius Regulus had a truly unmatched talent for being consistently and completely overshadowed by everyone around him. In an era where we have many hard-driving, difficult political generals, whether it's Marcus Livius Salinator, who is going after his opponents, whether it's Fabius pushing for his strategy and trying to undermine his rivals, whether it is the single-minded Scipio who simply informed the Senate that he was going to Africa, whether it was Marcellus really just chewing people out and insisting on getting his way and holding office after office. All of these guys, or at least the vast majority of them, were very difficult men. They were all headstrong and really just strove to be first. But Regulus, perhaps people liked him on some level because he does not seem to have had that kind of high-strung personality. He seems to be a real go-along-to-get-along kind of guy, which is odd considering that his father was definitely the opposite. His father was one of those go-getters with an overbearing, imperious nature. And among the many high-ranking magistrates of the Second Punic War, he has been consistently overlooked by both ancient writers who don't even know whether or not he fought and died at Cannae, and also modern students of Roman history. And it's not hard to see why. Although he was an important man and an important voice in the Senate, he just really doesn't stick out. This was a guy who was where he was and was who he was because of his family connections. But I don't mean that to demean him or to undermine the accomplishments he did have. When he was in office, so far as I can tell, Marcus Atilius Regulus was perfectly competent and capable. However, he was kind of a quiet, retreating guy, at least compared to the outsized personalities all around him. If he lived today and he were involved in government, he might be someone who worked on someone's staff or some bureaucrat who did policy, because he is a competent guy, but he's not the kind of guy who would go out and seek the limelight. And when you're in a system like Rome's, things tend to go better if you are more of an extroverted, larger-than-life figure. And that was something that Marcus Atilius Regulus clearly was not. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. I hope you've enjoyed this video in spite of the fact that it was about Marcus Atilius Regulus, who was boring. But I got you to listen for over 33 minutes to a video about someone who I said at the outset was boring. So if you're listening still, I have won a great victory. Peace out.